The Equestrian Wasteland. It takes everything, but gives only two things: freedom and dreams. Freedom to choose your path for yourself. Whether you will revel in the lawless expanse of the wastes and strike out for yourself at the expense of others. Whether you will remain an unknown survivor, to exist and accept the harsh reality to ensure your continued existence. Or whether you will attempt to rise up, to be a hero, and attempt to fight the wasteland itself. Dreams. To believe in the world that you wish to accept or deny. The darkened past, the cold present, or the future that can only be seen for yourself. Be it an unchanging mire or land filled with boundless hope buried deep in those few good souls left in the wastes. Every pony in the wasteland is given those two elements, to choose what makes them different for themselves. Every pony, that is, except for the forgotten masses, the slaves. Born into a life with no choice, taken from them not by the wastes but by other ponies, they toil, destined for nothing more than to be a cold statistic to the future. They have no freedom. They hold no dreams. This is the story of the slave who dared to dream. Fallout Equestria, Murky number 7. Chapter 1. Flying Without Wings. Slaving in Philly almost makes you wish for a winter rat-up. What was it like to be born a slave? I suppose I should explain something about the nature of being born into slavery, for it is somewhat different than the more common way of simply being captured and forced into labor. You never know the concept of choice. Your life is little but instruction following order following demand. Many would like to believe the myth of growing up in a harsh environment, to become a big and tough pony with the willpower to someday overthrow his masters. But, unfortunately, that was never going to be possible. The truth is that more often it stunts your growth, resulting in a subgeneration of physically small and weak ponies with no education and true little aspiration. How can a pony who has never known the freedom of the outside world even to begin to know what he would want from it? Sure, there might be some strong earth pony, powerful unicorn, or rare and agile Pegasus someplace that once did as the stories say. But let's just say that isn't possible for me and leave it at that for now. Instead, let me tell you about how I came to be where I am now. I grew up a runt, the smallest of the bunch, born to a weary mother sick with taint poisoning in a camp near Shattered Hoof to an unknown father. Suffice to say, given the way mares were treated in the slave camps, my father was likely one of the harsh figures giving us instructions and beating the ones who fell behind their quota. At first it was cart hauling, but as the years passed and it became clear I wasn't going to get any bigger or stronger to meet my master's expectations, I was instead sold off. My mother had begged and pleaded with them. She had offered anything, including herself, to make them reconsider and keep me there with her. Although the memory is now far gone, I still remember the slavers laughing her off. They told her that they could already have anything they wanted from her. We were slaves. We had no bargaining chips. I was sold for a measly 100 caps to a rock farmer off the eastern edge of the Whitetail Woods. Torn from the hold of my mother, I was immediately dragged into service upon the blank and lifeless duty of shifting rocks in some inane quest for gemstones. With a change in scenery came the change in hardships. While hauling carts and performing physical labor had broken me physically in the past and hurt my body's development, I now was a lone runt in a slave labor farm full of other delinquents just waiting for a new body at the bottom of the pecking order. They hurt me, bullied me, and stole my food and minuscule amounts of possessions. I had to learn to sneak out and try and steal some back at night, and I wasn't always successful. These days I still bear the scars of the lash upon my back. Truly, I wish I could say that this foalhood had taught me to be independent, brave, and determined, like other ponies of legend. But the truth is, I'm not. Being born a slave has one other problem. As I mentioned before, you do not know choice. You do not know how to think for yourself unless pushed to the absolute boundaries of physical needs like food or water. If a slaver asks you to jump, you ask into which radioactive crater. The thought of escape and a life outside slavery does not occur to a mind who has only ever known the life of a servant to some overbearing master's wishes. I have no free will, no courage to make my own choices, and few dreams of anything more than perhaps a painless death at the end of it all. If any more proof is needed, all I need to do is look at my flank to see the contract that seals the deal. For my cutie mark bears a looped set of chained manacles, their metal bands open and ready to slam shut around my legs below them should I ever fall out of line. Attained the day in which I was controlled more than any other. It is a continual reminder of my subservience to any master. I apologize if I cannot tell the rest of my life up until this point in great detail. From the day I received the most hated cutie mark a pony could have, I was locked into the bad hand I'd been dealt. I suffered the work set in front of me from a half-dozen other masters as they passed around the unlucky runt for paltry sums of caps each time. I was bullied, beaten, starved, and ignored to the point at which I even began to forget myself. Each year, everything became a little more blurry as my life became nothing more but an unceasing cycle of work, toil, and deprivation. I didn't even need to go into the wastes to find the worst it had to offer. Or so I had thought. For one day, my master in Manhattan received an offer he couldn't refuse. A deal from another master far across the wastes who was seeking any slave he could get his hooves on for a large sum of caps. And so, once more I was taken into a convoy of other hopeless ponies like myself and marched into the next place of labor. But this place was unlike the others, for my next destination was Philadelphia, serving under Master Red-Eye. Upon my arrival, I discovered this hell city of nightmare brutally made real. A living, breathing maze of harsh metal, red-hot heat, and thick choking smog surrounding a crater filled with deathly magical radiation. The scale was beyond anything I had ever expected, the workloads beyond what any other pony could hope to live up to, and an authority commanding us that deemed devoted to fanatical call for unity. Master Red-Eye often spoke at length to us from across a megaphone system of how we were aiding the unity that would save Equestria. To slaves like me, all unity truly held was the threat of being dragged away to partake in it. Those poor ponies never did return, nor did any stories on what unity truly meant. To make matters worse for the slaves on a more personal level, that same authority had no hesitations to weed out the weak and use them as examples, to better encourage others to work hard. Unfortunately, as I said, I am particularly weak. I snapped. It was too much for me on my own. The workload broke me and drove me into a mad, cowardly dash for a hiding space where I might shun the forces trying to control me and just forget it all. I don't remember how much about what happened upon that haunting night, when I broke from my designated area and galloped into the smoky darkness towards the ruined buildings to hide away. All that I remember is, they found me. I was punished with a sentence so severe that I scarcely even remember what they did. They hurt me, and told me I was to die soon as an example to others when they next held an event. I was thrown back into my pen and put back on rotation until this occurred. An event I quickly realized was going to be the arena of death, the pit. The pit was to happen tomorrow morning, and so that is my story, leaving me sitting scared in my pen in Philadelphia, alone and battered, waiting to die in the morning. Short story, huh? Yo, Runt! Looking forward to the show? Voices. They rang through my mind even as I fruitlessly attempted to sleep in my pen. I couldn't avoid them no matter where I hid. The disadvantage of being born to a sick mother with taint poisoning was the threat of minor mutation upon birth. In my case, That meant slightly different sized ears that were a little too sensitive. Sure, it's a great advantage to eavesdrop, but try having a slave master screaming into your face. It's like shoving a gun barrel into your ear and pulling the trigger. Not content with the stunted growth, no education, and eternal servitude until the day I die, the goddesses saw fit to give me the damn mutation, too. It's part of the reason I always tried to hide from the other slaves. The Philadelphia Fun Farms petting zoo performed much the same task it once did 200 years ago, keeping living things inside for the betterment of others. I pulled my meager clothing closer to my torso and curled even tighter into the corner of the pigsty. The red haze of Philadelphia drafted into one of the small entrances designed, presumably, for young pigs. What were young pigs even called, I wondered. One more of the unknown facts tossed into a pile that had, over life, accumulated in my mind. You scared? Frightened to die? You gonna scream? We want to hear you scream tomorrow. Or squeal like a piglet. Yeah, do that. Well, that answers that. There were 3 of them just outside, long-term slaves of Philadelphia. Each had been dragged into those same gates, kicking and screaming as they were welcomed to the painful existence that would become the rest of their lives. I regarded them as lucky. They hadn't been born into it. They had known freedom for a time. They celebrated their small advantage by immediately treating me as some sort of lower class the moment I had been hurled roughly into the same caged area as the unruly trio. I had been at the bottom of the pecking order many times, but this time it was a true threat. They stole my food, taunted everything I did, and when angry at the slavers, often used me as a convenient toy to let off some of their steam by beating some pony they knew couldn't return the favor. Before long, I had taken to hiding into the pigsty of the enclosure, the entrance too low and narrow to be accessible by any pony bigger than my own small size. It was cowardice, but I didn't care. I hadn't been taught to have pride or any kind of bravery. All I had to do was stay alive until my master next needed my presence to do work, even if that work was to walk to the arena to... You're gonna die, runt. Beaten, stabbed, shot, melted, bleeding out, choked. To that. Yeah. I hugged myself tighter, half wishing that if I clenched tightly enough, I could simply disappear into that corner. The sty was so stifling hot in the warm air of the city, making it impossible to tuck my head into my own hooves without getting wafts of uncomfortable warm breath every time I exhaled. Sleep wasn't going to happen. Not tonight. Between the taunts and the heat of my own crippling fear, dreams were the last place I wanted to be right now. So instead, I remained still and cowered, clutching my few possessions to the underside of my belly and softly crying to myself again. It's somewhat embarrassing to admit, but I cried a lot in life. One of the only 2 ways I could ever find to let emotion out properly to cope with it all. To weep and allow it all to flow out so often that it had become something of an involuntary reaction to hardship. As anyone could imagine, it had not done any favors for my position as the resident victim for every slave with half a mind of wanting false authority. How many times had I simply toiled away, pulling carts while sobbing openly, or running back to my enclosure so I could hide and let it all out? The other way was my one permitted vice in life. The item I clutched to myself as if it would someday save my life. My journal. Under the crimson nightmare and heavy industry of Philadelphia that had become my home and place of work under Master Red-Eye, it had taken on a greater meaning than ever before. I couldn't write or read. Slaves didn't get taught such things in the wastes, and my mother hadn't had the time nor the knowledge to teach me herself. No. Instead, I sketched. It was the only way that I could express myself. To put charcoal or graphite to yellowed paper and just let my emotions and feelings dictate what I drew. An outpouring of my own personal thoughts on what was troubling me or what I secretly wanted. But after entering Philadelphia, it also held a second purpose. It was my one little anchor against the madness that threatened to drive me to something stupid. A manner in which I might drive back the closing walls of insanity around me of abusive slaves, painful workloads, and terrifying masters. When I drew, it let me focus on something else for a brief amount of time. I never really looked at my own drawings that much. I just preferred to instead do more. The voices continued, beginning to expand, to go into detail of exactly how some badass stallion or vicious mare would end my life tomorrow. Part of me wanted to shout at them, beg them to go away or just leave me alone. But it hadn't worked the first time I had pleaded with them to let me be. In fact, it had only made things worse. Instead, I sat up, shaking off the stray rotten straw from my malnourished body with a weakened stagger, and I pulled out my journal. Biting the charcoal stick I had stolen from the small rocks we often pulled for work, I began to let myself fall into the trance. Trying to ignore the dirty taste of the stick, I spread out the paper of my journal in front of me. Charcoal met paper, a long sweeping arc that grew into multiple lines in the vague shape of something. Some pony. "Hey, runt! You crying in there? Come out and let us cheer you up. We'll give you something to eat after we're done digesting it." Raucous laughter followed. Ignore it. Ignore it all. Concentrate on the lines, the shapes and the curves. Half the time I didn't even know what I was drawing. "Live your life to the full, runt, 'cause it ain't like you're gonna be living for long. Oh wait, you don't have any life anyway. Ignore it. Ignore it." I tried to let my mind focus entirely on drawing. The sound of charcoal on paper and meditative bliss in the process brought. Let my subconscious do the work. "How does it feel knowing you're going to die?" I was weeping still, even as I tossed the charcoal into the corner with a pitiful whine and clutched the drawing close. I blanked out the laughter and the voices. Their taunts washed over me as I slowly held up my art to look at the finished piece. It held a small pony with different-sized ears lying dead in the pit, bleeding from horrendous wounds, the leering face of his killer glaring down from above. Trembling, sobbing gave way to full-fledged crying as I shut my journal sharply with a hoof and cowered once more into the corner as the voices came back, all too strongly once again. I woke to a sharp rapping on the outer casing of the pigsty, sending jolts of shock through me, the sound echoing all the louder through my ears in the confined space. Instinct rushed into my veins as I quickly scattered to my feet, grabbed my journal, and squeezed out of the hole into the harsh world outside. I hadn't slept well. Gunfire from some place nearby had disrupted my sleep multiple times. Some stupid pony losing it and making a run for it, probably. It wasn't the first time, either. On my first night, I witnessed a father blown in half by a huge rifle carried by one of Master Red-Eye's griffins for trying to stop them taking his foal away. A bright red glare forced my eyes shut as I stumbled wearily to my feet and gazed about me as the world came back into view. My world. Philadelphia. The ever-reliable industrial heart of old Equestria, now the reluctant industrial machine of the wasteland. Around that lethal balefire crater, its factories, forges, and mills rose like shredded but intact beacons of potential. Under Master Red-Eye's reign, the slaves here had reactivated many of them or carried out repairs with scavenged scraps brought by many of the stables that pocketed the nearby landscape. After years of renovation, the effect was less of a repaired ruin in some areas and more of a unmaintained build if you didn't look too closely to see the weathering from 200 years of the wasteland's weather. Despite the revulsion of my presence here, I found it all to be genuinely quite impressive. I knew those factories well. They were where I had my slave work broken in, tugging overborne carts of twisted scrap and newly manufactured ammunition. Where I had been driven through horrific work environments and made to labor in poisonous fumes that made me gag and choke for days afterwards. I dreaded for the condition my lungs must be in after my short few weeks of living in this nightmare. Murky number 7, explain to me right fucking now why you're not already on your way to your place of work. I blinked as my eyes adjusted, turning and immediately lowering my head to the ground in subservience to the unicorn slaver before me, just as I had always been conditioned to do. The stallion didn't care for it. A fell blow from his right front hoof to my face savagely laid me out on the ground 2 feet away, nursing a loose tooth and an aching jawline. I felt the unconscious instinct to cry as I cradled my head, but in the dry, warm smog of Philadelphia, my eyes were spent and couldn't muster the effort after last night. But a place of work? What place of work? Didn't this slaver know I was scheduled to die in a few hours? My voice was weak and hoarse, owing to a rough throat from little water and plenty of heat from the forges.
I'm to attend the pit later on this morning, Master. I'm sorry. I thought you'd know.
His hoof connected with my skull a second time, putting me right back on my rump again. Pain flared through my face as I felt my weakened body giving in to the hulking slaver's strikes. Terror shot through me at the threat of further beatings. I glanced up at him with one eye from beneath my hoof as I felt blood trickling on the edge of my lip. I must have bitten my own tongue. I don't give Celestia's right flank if you're heading off to the pit to die. What makes you think that gets you out of work until the time comes? He stated bluntly, leaning his face down to me. Red Eye brought you here to work. Now get your fucking rump in gear and get to fucking work. The unwashed stench of his breath nearly made me gag. Damn, but he was right. What choice did I have not to obey a command, even if I was trying to fight the unbridled terror wrenching in my gut at the thought that I was about to be sent to my death? He was my master, and I was the slave. Without a word, I nodded profusely and got to my hooves as I glanced upwards towards him. My current master, other than Master Red Eye, of course, was a dull blue stallion with a filthy cyan mane. He had introduced himself at first as having the name Whiplash. Well, it certainly fitted him, owing to the long coil by his side. He had one hell of a talent with using telekinesis, something many of the slaves in the Fun Farm petting zoo pens would attest to, myself included. Looking into those yellowed eyes gave me all the incentive I needed to quickly turn and gallop off across the petting zoo. Slaves often were not kept under shackle and chain in Philadelphia, nor in locked pens for the simple reason of, well, where could they run to? Master Red Eye's part of Philadelphia was surrounded by a colossal wall to keep us in more than anyone out. As such, slaves were often trusted to run to where they needed to be. If they were not spotted in the right places at the right time, wham. Besides, the real chains holding me were upon my flank anyway. As I crossed away from the pigsty home, I got a glance at the wall in the distance and reflected on its defense pointing outwards. Who in their right mind would be so stupid as to attack Philadelphia? If the wall wasn't bad enough, there was the chemical moat that had made me sick on my way in, the energized fences powered by some magical spark generator hidden behind the wall, and the towering guard posts lined with members of Master Red Eye's army. Oh, and the not-so-ignorable hideous pony head-shaped hot air balloons that eternally gazed down upon us from on high with the pink pony's freakishly large eyes. The same pony who was strewn on every Fun Farm sign, ride entrance, building, and advertisement. That same ridiculous grin and poofy curled pink hair that was out of place with everything else in Philadelphia. After just a few weeks in the Fun Farm, I really hated that pony. I exited the Fun Farm, glad only that my peers had been sent to their own places of labor before I had been woken. After last night, the last thing I wanted to do was face them again before I was sent to the pit. Inwardly, I hoped their workplace was someplace dangerous that I might never see them again, even if I were allowed to live for more than a few more hours. Perhaps the Parasprite pits, or off to investigate a stable death trap. I had never volunteered for such things. The big griffin who greeted my shipment coming in had told us that you could earn your freedom through them. However, I was too afraid to risk death seeking something I wasn't supposed to have anyway. Passing the entrance to the fun farm, I paused briefly, as I always did. Contained next to a sign, featuring that damned pony again, was a large mirror pointed at any pony who would be standing in queue to enter the amusement park. I couldn't imagine what it possibly had been used for other than making queues seem longer. I moved in front of it. My form was thinner than normal. It was a shaped mirror. How novel. I reached out to wipe the dust from the surface for a clearer look. My hoof felt no curve. The mirror wasn't shaped. It was perfectly normal. That scrawny, wasted figure was myself almost a month in Philadelphia. Great Celestia. I had never seen anything but smaller than normal and possessing thinner limbs, but this was horrifying. I could see my ribs if I lifted up my clothing. I quickly tightened and patched my jerkin around me again. Giving myself a once-over revealed nothing more than the ruin that was now my body. Dirty and dark blonde lanky mane? Check. Filthy dull green coat with patches of hair beginning to fall out? Check. Rad sores on my back, left, and muzzle? Check. Slightly oversized right ear and slightly undersized left ear? Thin-haired tail? Cutie mark bearing those gnashing manacles? Check, check, and I sighed. Check. Just your humble and pitifully weak earth pony here, minus the things earth ponies are often known for. Not shown? The painful wrenching of my stomach, crying out for sustenance, and the fuzzy head fevers that spoke of building radiation poisoning in my blood from the foul air and workplaces. Even without the pit, I began to rate my chances at survival for another month very low anyway. I raised a hoof to my face, dabbing my damp eyes at the soul-crushing sight of my own body being so irreparably hurt. Apparently, my tear ducts weren't quite done yet. I wanted nothing more than to collapse off my weary hooves and curl up on the ground, but long-conditioned instincts propelled me to continue. I had work to do, even if I didn't want to do it anymore. Turning from the mirror, I set a pace towards the armor manufacturing facilities. Road signs were useless to me, my inability to read rendering them all defunct. Briefly, I wondered if they had even meant the right things anyway these days as I stared at the tall rectangular sheet of metal on stands just outside the fun farm. It was bent away from the crater, clearly having been jostled by the missile as it struck Philadelphia and never truly fixed. The words were undecipherable to me, a mixture of dots and lines that held secrets I would never understand. Words weren't my thing. Shape and form was more my area of understanding, to sketch and shade in those quiet moments between shifts. However, there were 3 words that I knew, 3 words that I often wondered about. Murky number 7. My name. Like some sort of sick joke to poke fun at some pony when he's already down. The not-so-lucky one. Ha, ha. Laugh it up, every pony, at the slave with the silly name. That said, the exact circumstances were a little unknown to me, although you could logically piece together some of it. I was not an only child. My mother had been in possession of a few masters in her time, and had the attentions of various slavers too. I had been the 7th foal she gave birth to. I had no confirmation that this was the exact reasoning, nor did I like to think of it as the true one, for it pointed at my caring mother as someone devoid of imagination and life to the point she would number her own children. As for Murky, well, you only needed to look at the color of my mane and coat for that one. A particularly loathsome slave I had once worked alongside with in Manhattan had told me that it was because my mother hadn't truly cared for me at birth, because I wasn't an intentional child, hence the sick joke of a name. I knew her better. Even if that were true, she changed as I grew around her. Briefly, I paused in the road. It struck me suddenly that tomorrow, my own mother wouldn't even know that I was dead. I galloped the rest of the way to the factory in tears, my eyes finally proving they could find enough effort to cry any time as I sought the only familiar lonely toil of a slave's life to help me forget my own stupid wishes. The armor factory loomed over the motionless and ruined hovel surrounding it, the places where I presumed workers had once stayed close to their site of work. The run to the site had long exhausted the emotional hurt that I had wrought upon myself. Instinct and conditioning forced it unwillingly to the back of my mind as I stepped past the thick metal gates, feeling my lungs already burning from the exertion of arriving at all. As I galloped past the workers' quarters, I briefly wondered what it was like back then, to have choice of what you do in life, and no pony telling you what your day was to include. I pictured a young mare turning away from her cutie mark's proclamation of being a seamstress to instead do it only as a hobby while working as a baker. How did anyone choose what they truly wanted? When given everything, how do you know which route to take? What crusade would any pony undertake to find the thing that they truly wanted? Sometimes I wondered if being instructed was not perhaps so bad compared to that insurmountable choice. Looking into the red-hot forges ahead of me, the warmth mixing with the dry air to blast my wet eyes into dryness once more, I wondered who else would choose to work in a place like this. The factory office had been converted into the resident slave master's hub of activity. As I approached, surrounded by scalded and dire-faced ponies slaving away on the metal presses and molten vats, I could see her up above. Wicked Slit, a unicorn mare bearing just as wicked a blade that hovered alongside her. When not around her, some of the slaves had made occasional jokes as to whether the name meant the knife or, well, something else. The one slave who rebelled and told it to her face had lasted 3 unthinkable days regretting why that had been a very bad idea. Right now, her hooves rested on the railing, her horn magically enhancing the volume of her voice to be heard over the din as the blade floated casually to and fro beside her.
You lot! No, you lot! Get up off of the damned floor! You wanting to be dumped in the vats? Because it's all you're good for if you just lie around.
I turned, seeing 3 ponies collapsed on the floor, 2 male earth ponies and a female unicorn. The earth ponies had scorch marks around their faces from grabbing scalding hot metal by accident in what I knew was to be from work in the refuse yard. Some of that stuff stayed hot for days without showing it. I'd once stepped on one myself. All were clearly suffering from lack of water and too much heat inside. Even as I watched under the factory master's barked orders, a couple of slavers began hauling them off, too weak to even fight back. For their sake, I hoped the master was not intending to hold up her sick promise. Only then did I notice her eyes, watching me, foolishly standing alone with no work to do.
You! Get up here now! You're late!
Bobbing my head to show understanding, I quickly headed for the skeletal metal stairs rising above the shop floor of the armor facilities. As I climbed, the view let me fully grasp the weight of Master Red-Eye's intentions. There were hundreds of ponies in this place alone, and this was not the only factory. Sparks flew from heated metal as it was machined into place and cut upon conveyors. The sound of whirring cogs and the scream of tortured metal as it was warped and formed into new angles assaulted my eardrums. I had once asked for earplugs. Wicked Slit had asked if I'd prefer them cut off instead. Steam rose and enveloped the walkways that were thick with guards bearing long rifles and gas masks. Oh, how I envied those masks. Any relief from the poisonous air. A few even wore battle saddles. I envied them too. Call it a silly wish, but I'd always wanted one of those things, even if I had no use for it. Something about the mechanisms and the artful measure of weights and machinery lit a wishful appreciation for the artistic side of my mind. Perhaps one of those lighter ones that I could wear and hang things on would fit best. Briefly, as I trotted through the master's open doorway, I wondered if I might be able to get one of those in my last few seconds of life inside the pit. That'd be nice. The darker and larger part of my brain immediately reminded me that it isn't so nice when it means you are getting beaten to death. The bully's words came flooding back into my mind.
How does it feel knowing that you're going to die?
Choking back a reaction, I clattered over the lethally haphazard catwalks toward Wicked Slit's door. Inside, the office was marred with old furniture around a rotten wooden desk bearing one of those indecipherable terminals. I hated those things, whirring away with hidden secrets that I couldn't read, like something put on Equestria just to spite my illiteracy. Wicked Slit sat behind it, holding a cigarette magically in front of her mouth as she typed up, presumably, a report on the 3 slaves she needed replacing. Around her sat various scraps of her life, cigarette stubs and packs, a couple of half-empty bottles of Sparkle Cola, and her most prized possession, a wickedly curved knife that permanently stood upright with the blade embedded in the wood. Her desk was covered in the pockmarks of the tip from each day, but not as many as were left on her slaves. Once she had slit my back just enough to make the wagon harness rub it all day. Wicked Slit had a fiendish imagination with that blade. Right now, she didn't even look at me as she spoke in a surprisingly polite voice, belaying her ruthless attitude.
Do you know, Murky number 7, how many slaves we lose on a daily basis?
I shook my head. Frankly, it wasn't something I really cared to think about. All I knew was that it was no small number, about to be one less, my mind oh so joyfully reminded me. Every few days, a slave in my enclosure just wouldn't wake up. Toxic air was a major killer. Smog in the lungs and infections forming within every small wound you received were lethal too. She didn't look up.
I didn't hear you,
she intoned, the words carrying an underlying threat. Of course, she wasn't looking at me to see me clearly shake my head.
I don't know, Master,
I replied, stammering. My voice sounded so small beside hers.
I'm a mare, Merc.
She still didn't even turn from her work on the terminal.
I mean, I don't know. Ma'am?
I tried instead. Funny. Most female slavers preferred master as well. I presumed that she had some trouble with her stallion peers to gain the same level of respect in an environment given to masculine ego and shows of strength. If anything, it made her seem all the more lethal as I risked a glance and saw the puckered scars across her face, even a crack running up her horn. Casting magic must have been agonizing for her. It spoke volumes of her willpower, as loud as her voice, I guessed. She sat up, looking directly at me. I had forgotten something. To say it at the end too, perhaps.
I mean, I don't know. Is it, ma'am? Ma'am?
I muttered, trying not to look her in the eye. Or perhaps she was one of those more militant types from Master Red-Eye's army. They liked it at the beginning as well.
Ma'am? Ma'am? Ma'am?
Her left eye twitched dangerously as she shoved the heavy terminal away with her magic and leaned over the desk at me. Suddenly, I had some very nasty imaginative thoughts about that knife and varying parts of my body.
Do you think you're being funny, Merc? Or clever?
She intoned dangerously, the knife pulling itself out of the wood with a sound. Damn, that thing was sharp. I shook my head. I didn't want to risk anything else. Why had I gotten so chatty anyway? Perhaps the knowledge that I was about to have my throat torn out and left to bleed painfully to death had made me careless. My imagination became a very imminent reality as the knife flew over and rested against my throat. My squeak of terror stifled itself as I dared not move my throat in the slightest, but I felt the sweat of fear running down the back of my neck as its oddly cold surface rested, ready to pull back to the side if she decided to just get rid of me for back-talking her.
The truth is, Merc, she began again, too many. And do you know why?
She didn't give me a chance to reply.
Lack of effort. Red-Eye expects every one of you to do their utmost best. You have listened to his broadcasts?
I could hardly avoid them. Every night they echoed around my pen, blasting speeches of a greater future, of our sacrifice being for the good of our descendants and the survival of Equestria into better days. I had often heard slaves arguing, some claiming that perhaps he was right, and if they put their backs into it, they might somehow save themselves too. Others defied him. Quietly, of course. but would happily curse his name into the ground, all while groveling for forgiveness if any one of those fanatical griffins had heard them. Me? I didn't really think either way. One way or another, my purpose was to serve. If it were Master Red-Eye that commanded me to do this, I'd do it. What else was there for me to do?
Red-Eye expects much of you slaves and us slavers, Murk. And examples like those 3 down there are not good enough. It's enough to make me want to just start shooting every slave I see for insulting our great leader.
Great. She was a fanatic too. Oh, my wonderful life.
Which brings me, of course, to you, Murk.
Shit.
Given you were 10 minutes late, do you know how much you've delayed Red-Eye's plans? Care to take a guess?
She grinned sweetly, finally looking at me. Sweet Celestia, she was so angry she was grinning. Shouting I could deal with. I had been shouted at all my life. As painful on the ears as it was, at least you knew someone that shouted wasn't going to do something, I gulped internally, unpredictable. Well, it wasn't my place to argue back. Time to take a guess.
10 minutes, ma'am?
I hazarded. After all, why wouldn't it be? Apparently, that wasn't what she wanted to hear. Her hoof slammed on the desk, sending splinters of the rotten wood spraying to each side, and leaned over in towards me, her knife moving away from me. Instinct kicked in. I bowed my head down and knelt my front legs.
10 minutes!
Her voice echoed with magical power. I squeaked in pain as the noise assaulted my ears. Try an hour, Murk! Huh? As I lay there, hooves covering my ears, I struggled to grasp just where this magical number had come from. 1 hour!
You being late by 10 minutes cost 1 trip with the scrap wagons to the ammunition factory where the smaller scrap would have been needed. Now, because they lack that extra cart, they will have to run an additional cycle of the pressing machine. This, as you can imagine, takes additional resources that they will now need to order in from the resource silos. I have in front of me a particularly poorly spelled message of swearing sent from the slave master in the old iron-shod factories, wondering just what I'm doing wrong here. Tell me, Murk, if you are beginning to grasp the weight of you not pulling yours around here,
she bellowed, teeth clenching between each sentence.
Well?
Yes,
I began, my words feeling like a whisper against the wasteland storm.
I understand my mistake. I'm sorry for...
Don't be sorry, she speared right into my sentence. Be better. That cart needs taken now, along with a dozen others. Everything has to act like a well-lubricated machine in this city if we are to achieve our great leader's dream. I want to see at least 7 more deliveries by the end of the next hour, or so help me, I will personally ensure you will not want to return here tomorrow.
I won't be anyway, ma'am,
I spoke up, finding at least some solace in that I would be escaping her after the next few hours. Her eyebrows rose with a disdainful fury at the interruption.
I'm to attend the pit later this morning.
I couldn't resist it. She'd made my life a nightmare for the past week working under her supervision. I still bore a burn on my neck where she had put out a cigarette on me as her method of trying to show me that the molten metal sparks wouldn't hurt as much as defying her. The bullying last night had worn on my mind. The knowledge of death being so close anyway drew a certain carelessness to my words. Instinct led me to merely mutter them under my breath rather than blurt them out loudly.
So I presume you will have to find a 4th slave as well after I'm gone, ma'am.
Excuse me, Murk? Her voice drew enough of a picture of what would happen if I had said that any louder. Care to repeat that? I prayed to the goddesses that she had only thought I had just not spoken loud enough. She must have seen my lips moving, of course. Instinct was currently bucking my brain hard for saying that to the mare whom had just been threatening my windpipe with a blade just a few seconds ago. Well, there goes my attempt to be snarky for the day.
I said, ma'am.
My voice was shakier than before. the imminent threat of that wicked curved blade all too clear as it slowly and methodically began to stab the desk in perfect beats. That I should probably, She was advancing towards me, trotting right up to glare me in the face. Oh, goddesses, not the face again. It still hurt from whiplash.
Go on,
she intoned dangerously.
That I should hop to it.
I tried to smile, to grin my way past it. She didn't seem impressed, backing me right up against the doorway before turning away from me.
Then why are you still here, Murk?
That was my cue. Any slave would recognize a lifeline when they were thrown one. However, as I got up to my hooves and made to turn to the door, warning bells rang in my mind. Wicked Slit doesn't throw lifelines. She severs them. I tried to dive for the door as I caught her movement from the corner of my eye. Too slow. Her full buck catapulted me through the doorway with a cry of shock and pain as if my ribs, half bruised already, screamed in agony. I lay against the catwalk's dangerously open edge. Seriously, who designed these things? Clutching my chest as I looked up to see the door telekinetically slam in my face. With a sigh, I let my head hit the metal plating once more with a sigh of relief as I tried to convince my aching body to get up. All potential outcomes considered, I'd thought that went pretty well. Perhaps it says something about slavery that in my last day upon Equestria, I used the time being whipped while pulling a cart laden down with sets of heavily armored barding between the factory floor and the iron-shod firearms depot on the far side of Philadelphia. Either that, or I had some really weird tastes. It was approaching late in the day by the time that the slaver finally, mercifully detached me from that rusted and chafing harness. I could swear it was going to leave a stain, and sent me on my way home to the fun farm, happily reminding me that I was going to make his bets very easy later on. The moment the harness was released, my legs gave out. What little strength I had to carry half the trips of most ponies had worn me out completely to the point that if I had ever entertained the thoughts of actually fighting, I may have wanted to complain about how this was unfair. Unfair? Welcome to Philadelphia, Murky. I staggered from the colossal factory through one of the delivery doors. Along the edge of the storage flats were rows of non-functional and long-rusted Pegasus sky wagons for hauling cargo from Philly all the way to, well, wherever in Equestria it was needed. I pictured strong, free Pegasi swooping to and fro with huge weights upon their wagons, carrying them as if though they weighed nothing more than a feather, to be met happily as they'd made deliveries of, well, absolutely everything. It was hard to imagine, for it required Pegasi to be anything more than universally loathed by the wasteland I had seen. Scummy Sky Dwellers was the popular name to my last master as he drunkenly ranted about how they keep it all for themselves and how he couldn't wait for them to come down to the wastes so he could give them a piece of his mind. Yeah, the wastes hated Pegasi. I certainly hadn't heard of any living down here myself, yet in my lifetime. Probably for the best, given how they might be treated. Pulling my jerkin a little tighter, I cast a glance about me. Various slaves were trudging their way back towards the fun farm, clearly seeking a chance to rest their hooves before the slavers worked out where to send them next. A typical day in Philly, perhaps an hour of sleep, a little slop or oatmeal watered down, only usually with water, and almost every other hour dedicated to the work or travel between said work. I couldn't honestly say I knew a slave who had survived more than a few months at most. They looked a sorry sight, even by my standards, the veterans of Philadelphia. Boils and scabs of infected and savage wounds from Master Red-Eye's workers, machines, and even other slaves coated them. Most had tried to tie off wounds with scraps of fabric, while others simply just bled openly as they limped and shuffled across the broken landscape of the city. Even to a born slave, the sight was horrifying. My eyes traversed further, meeting the wary glances of various guards on tall catwalks running between the ruins that acted as their barracks throughout the city. One of them had re-angled to point his battle saddle at me and made a jerking motion with his head. Move along. I didn't dare hesitate for him to ask again. I fell in step with the rest of the trotting slaves. Just another little cog in the machine, albeit one about to be cast out. The crush became tighter as they filled through the manufacturing site gates, leading me to bumping flanks with other ponies on both sides. The smell was enough to cause me to almost dry heave on the spot as I witnessed their dirt and blood rub off on my own jerkin and flanks, smearing over my cutie mark. I shuddered, trying to block it out by closing my eyes and trotting on. It's not like it couldn't get any dirtier anyway, right? It was a mistake. My hoof caught a rock as I felt my balance stolen from me, and I fell headlong under the mass of slaves whom were beginning to pick up speed. A gunshot sounded as they were given inventive to hurry and let the next group through. Panic shot through me as I felt myself dragged down under their hooves, along with a few other unfortunates, and trapped underneath a stampeding rush of filthy slaves. I screamed. I begged them to stop, to let me up. None heard me as hooves cracked against my sides and face. Pain threatened to overwhelm me from the ceaseless crush. It was hard to breathe from all the dust kicked up. Claustrophobia fought with pain for my attention as both swarmed through my mind. I tried to pull myself up through it all, and away before any pony. A hoof landed on my leg. With a fierce intensity, pain flared from the joint as it was wrenched far past the limits of its movements. I'm sure that my cry of pain was audible above the entire crowd as I felt hooves grasp around me and pull me out from under the mass of slaves, dragging my dead limb with me. Dumped on the rocky piles either side of the road, I lay back and took a deep breath, feeling the air rush to my lungs away from the dust, before coughing heavily as my lungs rebelled from their infections. A movement beside me perked up my ears and caused me to half pull back in fear.
Whoa there. You all right?
A mare's voice. I spun to look, yelping in pain as my leg reminded me that it still wanted my attention too. A young unicorn was half crouched beside me, hoof extended as though it was about to touch me. A gentle creamy yellow coat with a long two-tone mane of light orange with incredibly thin hazy red streaks. Her mane was like every slave, filthy and bedraggled. I got the sense she might have her tail as long as her mane, but the end looked like it had been torn off. Hell, her entire look would have been very vibrant and flowing if she had not been dulled and battered as a slave like myself. She wore an alien look, one I didn't properly understand until memory began to kick in and reminded me that it was a face of concern. The last time I'd ever seen that was on my mother. Internally, I forced myself to not break down again right in front of my temporary savior, and forced myself to speak.
I guess so.
I hesitantly stammered, voice low. Social skills were not among my chief abilities. Wait, I guess so? While I'm sitting here with a possibly broken front right leg, a loose tooth from 2 blows to the face earlier, bruised ribs from wicked Slit, lash scars on my back, sick, infected, probably dying of radiation, and about to assuredly die in under an hour? Yeah, really okay, Murky. She didn't seem to believe me either, leaning forward to gently help me to my hooves before some guards spotted us. Closing my eyes, I gritted my teeth as I tried to move the injured leg. With a grunt of pain, I bent the joint as normal. It wasn't broken. Badly sprained, but the joint was still intact. I let out a sigh of relief before staggering and promptly fell over once again with a soft thud. Perhaps I'll lie down just a little bit longer.
You're lucky you weren't killed under there,
the mare continued to speak, nursing my leg briefly before sitting back, her gaze passing over me. From the look on her face, it was clear that, even though she was trapped in here too, she considered me a particularly weakened-looking pony.
Now, come on. We need to get going. I can't be late or... Yeah, I know the feeling,
I muttered, with my eyes averted. Talking too much wasn't my place. I half expected a slaver to come around any second and beat me for talking at all. Testing my weight on a limb, I stood, and as I did, my saddlebags revealed themselves to have been torn in the stampede, my sketchbook journal tumbling out onto the ground before the mare. Blinking, she looked down, nosing it open with her, nose. She was probably too tired to use magic right now anyway. I made a move to retrieve it, only pausing as I noticed she was actually looking, not laughing or trying to steal it. Instead, I just waited, feeling oddly full of apprehension as she flicked a couple of pages while I trotted to and fro, trying to work the movement back into my foreleg joint. I didn't even yelp in pain to not disturb her oddly peaceful-looking investigation. Well, not more than twice anyway. Certainly no more than 4. Perhaps 6 if Squeaks counted.
This is very interesting stuff,
she commented, eyes not leaving a picture I'd drawn of the Philadelphia gates. My first night here. She flicked some more before smirking and stifling a laugh.
It seems you have a liking of mares, though.
She looked up to me and grinned. I blushed and fell back a little, rubbing my head with a hoof as I tried to think of an excuse. Truth is, well, perhaps I did sometimes find my subconscious drawing out a particularly nice-looking mare I may have seen or worked beside. I had always intended to add the clothes. Honest. I stepped in, albeit painfully, closing the journal with a hoof. That stuff was still private, no matter what strange spell of peace she seemed to exude to make me not have grabbed it from her the moment it fell. I just blushed as she giggled slightly at the act, seemingly not offended before standing to her own hooves herself.
I'm sorry,
I began, trying to keep my voice steady above embarrassment.
I should go.
She just nodded, apparently understanding before knocking a tangled knot of hair behind her ear with a hoof.
All right, then. Off you go before we get caught.
The mare bit her lip and her eyes fell on the sketchbook again resting at my side.
I really do envy that. The ability to draw whatever you want, whenever you want. It's like an escape, isn't it?
What? An escape? What on Equestria was she talking about? Drawing was just automatic. I couldn't choose what I draw. Could I? The mare was turning to go. She trotted away toward the opposite entrance of the fun farm, clearly a resident of another enclosure, possibly the bumper plow pit. I wanted to say something, to try and make up some excuse for some of the pictures, to ask what she meant by drawing what I wanted. But she was already too far away, and I dreaded shouting with slavers all around us with their ever-watchful eyes for dissent and rule-breaking. A little voice began to ask me in my mind why I hadn't been afraid of her, and why I had the sudden urge to draw her. Not like the pictures she had seen, but as, well, what I saw, a strangely at ease slave. The thoughts struck in my mind. Just one last sketch before I headed off to the pit. What were they going to do? Sentence me to death? Justification in mind, I quickly, figuratively speaking, made for the petting zoo and my hidey hole in the pigsty. I looked back once or twice at the mare walking off. I could swear she was doing the same. That was better. Lines became curves. Curves became shapes. Shapes came to life. Across the floor of the pigsty I had scattered picture after picture. From the moment I had pulled myself through the small gap, hounded by the taunts and pursuits of my fellow slaves, I had retrieved the charcoal. The tastes of the floor corner reminded me not to throw it away again, and set to work. I didn't think. I didn't consider. I just drew. As ever, allowing my subconscious to take over, to draw what came to my mind first. Soon my journal had a few good new entries. I had struck past last night's picture as fast as I could to add more and see what they would bring. 1 page, 10 minutes work. Wicked Slit's knife with her paralyzing gaze from behind. Another page, 5 minutes work. Myself and the cart with darkened lines to add the weight. Another page, 3 minutes work. The pit, sketchy and terrible. Page after page filled with the imagery of my time here. Even in my drawings I couldn't escape it. I had wanted a picture of her before I forgot her face, but it just wouldn't come out. Like a machine in Philly's foundries working to the same pattern, I found my sketchings fall into patterns that I could not control. Once, a rare slave that actually conversed with me had asked why I never chose what I drew. How could I? Choice was not mine to have by birth. But now I wondered, at the end now with nothing else to live for, no work to be done anymore, what if I chose to draw something nice? That mare's wondrous hope in her voice as she said that drawings could be an escape of itself rung in my mind. I took another page, leafed the parchment over, and gripped the dirty charcoal in my mouth loosely. Perhaps if I drew some more random lines, then made what I wanted from it, maybe that would work. Trembling, each sweep of the charcoal didn't seem to add anything. How could this ever work? I didn't have the mindset or belief to ever think for myself. All I was doing was, I saw potential. With gusto, my charcoal flew onto the paper. Instinct not restricted by my life kicked in. Artistic form. The things I look at. Specific memories flared in my head. Curling up next to my mother. Stealing from my master back on the rock farm. Running away to hide in Philadelphia. Mouthing off under my breath to wicked Slit and sitting with another pony glancing at my journal without any hint of derision. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I drew for myself. I jolted back from the paper, breathing hard as I dared to let my eyes descend upon what I had beheld before me. It was me. Just me. Just that small pony staring back at me from the bottom left of the page, not even filling the space I could have, like it was waiting on some pony else to fill the gaps beside him with something else. It was smiling. My hoof went to my mouth. When had I last smiled? I honestly couldn't remember. But here it was. My sketch's lips curled upward in a joyful, playful laugh that I wish I could have heard for real.
Hey, Runt, you ready? They're calling for you. Time to die.
I ignored it. This was more important. I threw the page over and grabbed the charcoal again. Lines into curves. Curves into shapes. Lines into...
Life is over, Runt. We can see them coming to chain you all up and drag you there.
Charcoal flew. I drew faster than I ever had before. I was in control of this. Not them. I could control what I drew. The form came to be the mare. She was looking curious, staring off the page at me as though trying to work out why I had drawn her. I could choose. I could create anything. Murky number 7, you are ordered to the pit. Come out, be chained, and let's get going so we can all win some caps on you. The voice of the enclosure master. Oh, goddesses, no. I had just learned how to do this, yet I could feel my legs trying to pull myself on conditioned instinct to obey. I tried to reach the paper once again. One more. I can go one more and just be laid out. The charcoal snapped at the tip from how hard I was pressing. The drawing went messy. It didn't matter. Stains of tears were appearing on it. I choked down the embarrassment at crying over something as silly as all this, as I felt a rap on the pigsty. You there, slave. Is Murky number 7 in here?
You bet. He's cowering like a...
There was a crunching sound followed by the sound of some pony hitting the ground hard. I didn't ask for your opinion. Guards, tear this damn thing apart and get him out of there. Oh, Luna, help me. I felt the sty shake and buckle under their savage hoof blows on either side. The drawing was only just taking shape. I knew what it was. It was... The roof snapped off. Smog and dust seethed in from the outside world as a silhouetted gas mask glared in and spotted me frantically scribbling. I squealed as I felt a second slaver grab my jerkin in his teeth and effortlessly lift me, whining in pain as my bruised ribs protest at the sharp movement. I pulled down with all my meager weight. One more line. The pulling intensified as a second guard joined.
No, please,
I begged them as I felt the charcoal fall from my mouth.
I have to see her once more.
With a great tug, I was yanked through the splintered wall of the pigsty and thrown on the ground, weeping in a heap. I spat out the foul charcoal and reached out for my journal as 2 guards magically hog-tied me with chains before dragging me away. The journal had fallen open on its side, visible to me as I was pulled off, writhing and screaming through tears to be reunited with it. The picture I had so desperately tried to finish stared back at me, tugging at my heart and stirring emotions long dead. My mother, once again being forced to watch me being taken from her. I was going to die. I lay against the wall of the pit's slave confinement area, feeling the cold concrete seeping its chilly touch through my torn jerkin. It was dark, the only light being that coming from inside the pit itself. A thick gate sat at the front of the area, the only thing that separated me from death now. Not that I could think too much about the gate. I was going to be busy screwing my wet eyes closed and cowering in the back of the corner with my hooves trying to cover my suffering ears. The crowd were like a sonic blast of pain. Their screams and bloodthirsty bellows echoed down into the enclosed black gate side of the arena with me. Their hoof stomps in freaky unison felt like a slap around the head each time. I was going to die. I didn't want to die. The massive noise subsided down from an assault on my senses to being merely uncomfortable as I heard an announcer start talking up the crowd. That big griffin, whatever her name was. Her words whipped them up into a frenzy. I could picture them salivating, eagerly sharing the stories of the little buck who they would all get to watch being horribly torn apart. Opening my eyes, I looked around, shivering. At the front stood numbers 1 and 2. Philadelphia pit matches apparently involved 2 teams of 6 ponies. You fought 1-on-1. The winner remained to fight in the next battle. Blackgate was my team. Numbers 1 and 2 seemed to know each other. 1 red mare and a dull yellow stallion, respectively. They looked tough. But then, every pony looked tough compared to me. Even that little unicorn mare, who was number 3, looked like she could buck me senseless with that metal thing on her foreleg. Number 4 was nothing special. Just some blue buck. I was number 5. The one to die after those 4 got killed off. It would happen. I had seen pit fighter ponies before in Philadelphia. They were hard as nails with a bad attitude that would revel in the howling of the crowd as they took apart their opponents with as much... I gulped. As much pain as possible. I was going to die. Painfully. Once again I found the corner, squeezing myself into it as tightly as I could, and prayed that the other ponies in this team wouldn't hear me crying. Unfortunately, luck never was quite on my side as I sensed a hulking movement from beside me. Number 6. Put on a braver face there. Don't let them have the pleasure. A significantly deep, low and mature stallion's voice that almost trembled with the threat of painful volume if he really got going. Okay, that I didn't expect. Through terrified and tear-filled eyes, I looked up at the source to see number 6. Looming in the darkness at the back of the black gate pen, number 6 filled the entire portion he took residence in. He was kneeling down on all fours, and he was still taller than me. A huge, muscular earth pony with a dark red coat and crimson mane looked down at me. He was, without a doubt, the biggest and scariest pony I had ever seen in my life. I could barely even tell where his thick muscle-ridden back separated from his neck. Wicked Slit was a little filly foal compared to this stallion. An ugly, scar-coated face stared back at me, one eye completely bloodshot and one ear missing entirely. Dyed tribal markings coated his body in black swirled designs to look like, well, anything painful. I saw barbed wire rings on his forelegs, angular designs around his bloodshot eye, and gang symbols upon his sides. Almost a third of his body was covered in them. Puckered scars intertwined with the markings. When he moved even slightly, a huge mass of muscle contained in his body became all the more obvious. But those eyes, wild and filled with the promise of absolute violence, they scared me to the point of backing away from him. He was absolutely terrifying. His face followed me as I crossed the darkened area, trying to get away from him. I glanced behind me. 1 and 2 were staring out of the expanse of the pit. 4 seemed to be explaining something to 3. No pony was paying us any attention. I squeaked in terror. I didn't like being left alone with this massive, half-feral earth pony. He just sat there, staring at me trotting away from him. With a deep sigh, he looked toward the gate.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Officially confused now. I tilted my head towards him even while backing my rump right up against the wall. What? I didn't dare raise my voice above a hushed whisper. Who knew what those other ponies were like at the front of the Black Gate slave area?
I'm sorry that you need to end up here with me,
he continued, shifting to his hooves. By the sweet goddesses, he was huge. Add to that, none of it seemed to be anything but corded muscle. Suddenly, I felt pretty glad he wasn't in the other team.
You're sorry?
I'm sorry that I cannot protect you.
His voice hit a low note, an odd ring of sadness surrounding the bestial imagery he evoked in his accent and appearance.
You don't deserve this. Not like some of the rest of us do.
I didn't really know what to make of that. I wasn't given the opportunity to make anything of it.
Round 1,
came the booming voice of the Griffin announcer. I turned and looked out of the gate as it began to rise.
May the games begin.
I heard the huge stallion mutter as he trotted up beside me, eyes narrowed. Suddenly, although I knew I wouldn't be around to see it, I felt pity for whatever poor mare or buck ended up going hoof to hoof with him. I still felt more pity for myself. I was going to die. My composure was not improving. I stood behind 3 and 4 as I watched whom I now knew was called Blood go out first into the arena and be swiftly torn down. I had to physically stuff a hoof in my mouth to stop myself from howling in fear as I shrank back, knelt down, and tried to blot out the cries of the crowd as they spotted death in their sights. Part of my mind liked to pretend I could hear the bullies braying for my blood to be next. Beside me, Number 6 stared down at me with those wasteland-worn eyes before looking up, as though judging the opposition. I could hear him whispering something to himself, but with so much ambient noise, even I couldn't figure it out. Oh, goddesses. That would be me in there. Number 2 stepped forward as the gate opened. The announcer cried his name as I saw him clearly go looking for revenge. Daffodil. Closer to the gate now, I got a better look outside. The pit itself was an old ice rink, drained only until the concrete remained and sheathed in a giant cage filled with pressure plates and old blood stains mixing with the new stains draining away from Blood herself. Some of it was splattered across her opponent. Sin something. I had missed his name from covering my ears against the painful noise of the crowd. Once again, I witnessed death. Daffodil's opponent stood no chance. He even tried standing on a pressure plate to activate a bucket load of mines from above, trying to rain them down upon Daffodil. The big buck swiftly dodged the deafening shockwave before delivering the most horrifying death I had ever witnessed. One after another, I heard all too clearly the snaps. He broke his opponent's bones. All of them. While he was still alive. I felt my legs go weak. Great heaves in my throat becoming choking sobs as my eyes flooded with tears and terror overtook me. I ran to the back of the slave area where the doors were, where we had been brought in. I had to get out. I didn't want to die. As I approached it, the 2 guards assigned to supervise us, along with the 3rd slaver whom had slapped these numbers on our flanks, were waiting. With a laughing shove, the trio hurled me right back into the Black Gate area once again. I curled up. More sickeningly wet cracks came from the arena, each in turn with the roar from the crowd. I don't want to die. I don't want to die.
Round 3. From the Black Gate, we still have Daffodil.
I tried to tune that griffin out. Each round brought this one step closer to me. Blood was down. Daffodil wouldn't last 5 more fights, and the 2 ponies in front of me were, well, they weren't number 6. That behemoth of a pony stood silent as ever, just staring into the arena beside me. Briefly, I tried to repress my terrified thoughts, to concentrate on the artistic side of his dyed coat and its designs. Let's see. Barbed wire. Sharp edges. Not helping. Shivering and trying to fight my imagination showing such thoughts of drawn-out end to me, I instead took a look at the other 2 ponies. Number 4 wasn't anything special. Just another slave from Philadelphia. I wondered what he had done to deserve this. Probably something a little less cowardly than my own. Number 3. It wasn't often I'd saw ponies whom I could look eye to eye with without requiring to tilt my head upwards to do so. Well, I would, if she wasn't facing away from me into the arena herself as Daffodil finished pounding the corpse of his opponent. Briefly, my eyes glanced to that thing on her right foreleg. Some sort of device. Recognition flickered in my mind. Hadn't Master Red-Eye worn one of them? Momentarily, curiosity overcame fear as I gazed all the more. I couldn't see her cutie mark. That number sticker covered one side. Shifting quietly to the other, I noticed what it was. Another one of those devices. Right there on her flank. Just what? What did that signify? Skill with them? Given I had no idea what they were, I realized any guessing was a bit pointless. Whatever it was, it couldn't be that deadly. The slavers wouldn't have left it on her otherwise, so I couldn't even imagine her bringing down every one of the fighters to protect my worthless hide either. A momentary realization hit me as I realized I was craning my head to stare at her flank to see said cutie mark. And number 6 was glancing down at me with a raised eyebrow. With a start, I shrank back, averting my eyes. Damn it. Why did every pony assume that about me? I wasn't looking there. I didn't stare at mares like that. I just drew them. That was different. Number 6 just seemed to chuckle quietly, a sound that sounded like rocks scraping together. He fell into indomitable silence as he stared back into the arena and narrowed his eyes. I followed his gaze into the concrete pit and witnessed my killer. A zebra. The zebra. Even I had heard of her. The most terrifying pit fighter in Philadelphia. Exotic, lethal, and utterly without mercy, they said. No pony could ever hope to bring her down. A veteran of 4 events and a current crowd favorite to coldly murder any pony that dared stand in her way. Truth be told, I hadn't seen her before myself. I didn't know anything about her fighting style or capabilities. I didn't need to. Any zebra to gain that reputation must have one hell of an ability to back it up. I couldn't help it. I cowered, using number 3 to block my view of her as I crouched down closer to the floor and shivered. This just wasn't fair. Even on the floor, I could still see past 3's legs through the grill of the gate. The zebra. What was her name? Zen? I couldn't hear anything over the ambience of the crowd shrieking with excitement at the sick games they were witnessing. The goddesses seemed to want to please those vicious mares and bucks that took out all their frustrations on us poor arena victims. The sun baked down from above the cloud curtain. The effect was less of a direct heat and more of a stifling, ambient raising of the temperature in the still air. Uncomfortable and hellish to suit the carnage currently being wreaked in the pit. This was wrong. I saw the combatants fight. I screwed my eyes shut as I saw Daffodil send the zebra to the ground. I winced as she returned the favor. Even above the crowd, I could hear the savage hoof strikes on one another. I couldn't do this. I wasn't built for this. Daffodil was brutal and resourceful, the zebra lithe and deadly. I saw a mine kicked into the air and whinnied to myself as the savage detonation assaulted my senses. This wasn't fair. It certainly wasn't fair for Daffodil. Even as I watched the zebra continually begin to get the upper hand, speed beat power, lethality trumped over savagery. With one hideous crunch, I heard his neck break. My mind raced. One more of hours down, and one more towards my own presence in there. I hadn't lived a good life. Just a slave. A dirty and downtrodden slave with no freedom and no dreams of his own. As I watched number 3 bravely walk towards her own death, I finally and completely broke down the moment the gate slammed shut. Emotion welled up, fear mixed with bitterness that I had never ever been given a chance. Life seemed fit to just screw me over at every opportunity. All shame was thrown away as I did what I did best. Cried. I cried more than I ever had. Even more the day my mother was taken from me, because now everything was about to be taken away from me. I didn't want that. I didn't want to go through the pain. I was afraid of what they would do to me. I thought that 1,000 times today, but now it finally rammed home with the full intensity as the zebra launched at her newest prey. I was going to be beaten to death. The weight of that simple realization was impossible to grasp. I emotionally spilled over, pathetically reacting with no hint of dignity or poise. Number 4 and 6 stared at me as I pressed against the gate whimpering, quaking violently, and trying not to look as I heard number 3 being brutalized and beaten to death, far worse than Daff was. Why was it that my life had to go this way? Why me? I didn't want to die. I didn't. A spark, like a bright flare, erupted from the pit, catching my half-closed eyes like a beacon and blowing up dust from the pit's concrete through the gate to my face. A sound of magic being ignited came from the middle. Hyperventilating still, I shifted and fell backwards, covering my eyes with my hooves before slowly glancing through them, struggling to see directly into the light. An aura of unicorn power streamed through the center, enveloping the zebra entirely, as every barrel that hung from the pressure plates clanged open in unison. The green chemical flew from them, barely even touching the ground before being caught up in a swirling net of immense telekinetic magic. My jaw hit the floor, eyes unblinking as I witnessed the foul liquid spray beautifully in all directions, coating the cage and blocking all vision into it. I had seen unicorn magic plenty of times, but never like this. Only my position near the floor let me get to see under the green goo smeared across the gate. I hadn't even blinked as it landed on either side of me. Luck, it seemed, allowed me to sit undisturbed before this miracle. Number 3. She was flying without wings. I saw the scene that would be seared onto my memory until the day I died. Amongst the drifting dust of the telekinesis spell, her horn bursting with overglow, number 3 ascended to the air above, taking with her the zebra that had so badly hurt her. A nimbus of magic surrounded them both as she flew directly upwards and away from all the blood, all the death and pain, away from slavery, and to her glorious escape. Such courage in the sight of Red-Eye himself. I could hear the bloodthirsty crowd bellowing in protest and shock. The griffins opened fire in vain, their bullets missing her at every turn like fate and destiny themselves guided that little mare to be unharmed. An angel blessed by the goddesses, a light-bringer whose ray of hope speared through the darkness to ignite a fire in my heart. I felt myself fall back and sit dumbly, my mouth hanging open as I witnessed the spectacle before me, feeling the light across my face. I must have been silhouetted against the gate, a small figure in the presence of a legend before my very eyes, defying gravity so boldly. She disappeared into the searing dust and out of my vision, but for a steadily fading glow. To cast off the shackles of slavery and escape. The thought struck my mind as ridiculous, but here it was. The myths were true. A great unicorn of powerful magic escaping from her masters to live a free life. As I watched that wondrous and beautiful sight flow away into the dust through a rapidly fading chemical goo barrier, I felt myself smile. I had never felt joy like that before. It felt so good. I just wanted to keep smiling forever. I wanted to go with her. My mind struggled to grasp the concept, to identify it and take hold of the urge. Even as I heard the slavers rush into the black gate area to secure us, and the bellowing of the griffins to trap the breakout before it left the fun farm, I had the first true inkling of something. A wish of my own. I dared to dream. I wanted to escape. You, slave, on the ground now! The slavers burst in from behind us, 2 guards and the third who slapped that sticker on my flank, moving to keep us down. I barely heard them. I just simply sat there with my eyes trained on the roof of the cage within the arena. The goo had run its course and the dust began to settle. All that remained above was a small opening. A previously padlocked swing door in the ceiling of the cage hung open, swaying in the aftermath of such magical fortitude. Something about that door struck a chord with me, just idly swinging. The last evidence of the defiance against Philadelphia's aim to keep us inside. I could hear gunfire, explosions, and all sorts of noises as the crowd stampeded out of the arena. A slaver's hoof dragging me by the jerkin away from the gate was the first thing to waken me from my reverie. I said, "On the damn ground, slave!" The slaver's voice betrayed a nervousness turned to anger. I didn't blame him. My own voice would probably be squeaky and incapable at the moment. I was still trembling after all. With a twist, I was hurled onto the ground as I heard shackles being drawn by the slaver unicorn's companion. Call that magic? Look at number 3, buddy, as they moved towards me. Only as they began trying to pull my hooves up did I finally begin to shake my head clear and get a grasp of why they were being as deliberate. The slaves were not taking this idly. Behind the door leading to the black gate, I heard the sounds of rebellion. Slaves were crying out, rioting in the aftermath of one mare showing them there was more to hope for, and that red-eye could indeed be defied. One slaver was watching the door, telling me that perhaps the slaves outside were not being beaten down as easily as the slavers would have liked. It seemed number 6 thought the same way. The biggest pony I had laid eyes on in my life seemed to me to be a slow and deliberate stallion. I had imagined that an attack from him would be like a boulder rolling slowly, deliberate and implacable. Oh, how wrong I was. He moved like a boulder, all right, but one tumbling madly down a cliffside. The slaver didn't even stand a chance as the colossal weight of number 6 barreled into him, one giant hoof plowing the slaver's head into a concrete wall with enough force to make a sickening crunching sound. Suddenly, I was very glad that I couldn't see all that well. The slaver, currently straddling me with the shackles, looked up, eyes wide as he witnessed his brethren murdered in an instant before him. The third slaver turned from finishing his shackles on number 4 as well, both matching the cold stare of number 6. "You?" The slaver's voice quivered. "You stay right there." "Stay?" "Funny. I was going to say the same thing to you," muttered number 6 dangerously before launching himself at the 2. I curled up as I felt his size run over me to reach them. A series of panicking screams and dull thumps as the pair were set upon by the terrifying pony. I risked opening my eyes. I saw number 6 moving like a blur, thick limbs lashing out wildly. He bucked one slaver against the wall hard enough to whiplash the target's head back into it, spinning himself around to dive and grapple his second opponent, even as the slaver attempted to draw a baton in his mouth. With a grunt and a heave, the second slaver was roughly hurled across the black gate, clean over my head to land in a heap with his colleague, the pair groaning in pain. Even as they attempted to stand, the first nursing his rapidly bleeding head, number 6 was on them. His forehead collided with its first target, the sound like a rock hitting a wall. The slaver dropped, unconscious in an instant, even as number 6 began beating the last slaver's head off the wall repeatedly. Eventually, a sharp pop signaled his end too as his agonized screams suddenly ceased. Almost as an afterthought, wiping the sweat from his brow, number 6 raised a hoof and stamped it sharply on the unconscious buck's neck with enough force to... I felt sick. I had seen ponies beaten all their lives, but this was different. Slavers beat to intimidate. This pony had simply been killing them. Cold and calculated, the stallion had taken 3 slavers apart in less than a minute with nothing more than sheer power and ferocity. Brute force at its most simple level. No, that wasn't right. Even as I watched him now, his eyes flickered to and fro. He was thinking, watching for other elements. Suddenly, why he had been paying such close attention to the arena earlier made sense to me. He wasn't about mindless brute force at all. That violence had been driven by a cold and pragmatic mindset that simply went for the kill, using unreal strength and viciousness to reach it however it was most practical. Part of me wondered how he would have fared against that zebra. Agility and precision against deliberate fury and power. Until I remembered I would have been dead before I knew the outcome of that fight. I wasn't sure which scared me more. Although looking at the mismatched and bloodshot eyes turning to glare at me, I reached a decision pretty quickly.
Don't kill me too, please!
I shrieked at him, backing away towards the gate, eventually pressing my back against it to stay away from the huge earth pony.
I'll stay quiet! Please, please!
I barely even noticed as I pressed my back against the gate that the green goo was burning the back of my neck. Fearing of number 6 overrode any such feeling. He simply trod over to me, staring down. By the goddesses, his face was streaked with the blood of the slavers he had just killed, the lines dripping off his muzzle oddly flowing the contours of his dyed coat markings. His face lowered to look me in the eyes. I found I couldn't even blink as I met his glare. That one bloodshot eye seemed to twitch a little on habit before he drew himself back a little, grabbed my jerkin in his mouth, and swung me to my hooves. "Come on, Pipsqueak," he intoned, heading for the door. "Tag along, and you'll maybe get out of this alive too." Surprise rang in my mind. I guess that I really didn't have much of a choice. The underside of the pit was an absolute chaos. Even just outside the door to the Black Gate, I witnessed slavers lashing and threatening their slaves with whips, guns, and even battle saddles. They were not going down quietly, for even as I crept out of the door in number 6's shadow, I saw one slaver pulled down by 4 weakened laborers after being beaten over the head with a magically hurled sledgehammer. Gunshots rang out every few seconds. I really needed some earplugs, sending scattered screams and waves of fleeing slaves down the hallways. Number 6 didn't at all appear fazed. He glanced around before picking a direction and galloping off. I struggled to keep up with his long and determined strides. Diving to one side or the other, my gallop was nervous and unbalanced. What was I doing? The slaver told me to stay put. The little slave in my head screamed at me to cease and stop, that my masters would not appreciate this. Weapons were strewn upon the ground where they had fallen from now unlocked guard storage. Slaves unable to grab one in time were arming themselves with tools from the occasional bit of furniture. I saw them trying to break into what I knew was the armory, where all the pit's more lethal weapons, like firearms and magical auto-axes, were kept to be put in the barrels. Screams sounded in the air as the smell of gunpowder reeked around me. I almost slipped in a few puddles of what I was sure was not water, as I tried not to think about the wetness upon my hooves. Ahead, a slave and an overseer of the pit came tumbling out of a doorway that held behind it a small fire. Even as they savagely wrestled on the ground, I saw scraps of paper rolling out from behind them in a blazing room, with no evidence on how the fire even started. Misfired magic, maybe. I don't know. I ran through the smoke, holding my breath before tripping over a corpse on the other side so suddenly that I still felt my lungs trying to run even as the world rotated by 90 degrees. My lower jaw slapped on the ground with a painful rattle, jamming my teeth together. That loose tooth from this morning took its time now to remind me of its presence with an uncomfortable little shimmy in its socket. Wincing and bringing a hoof to my mouth, I glanced around quickly before immediately feeling the urge to just stop. I saw slavers regaining control here. Normality was being restored as more and more slaves waiting for the next rounds in the back were being beaten, shackled, or simply shot to quell their reactions. Before my eyes, I saw many of them murdered when they had already surrendered. Perhaps I should just lie down. Let them shackle me. Don't take any chances. Flying without wings. No, the feeling in my heart was still too strong. The bonds were heavy on my conditioned mind, but I had now been shown the light to dare to defy. I turned and galloped after number 6 once again, seeing that he had plowed ahead without waiting at all. Several slavers had tried to get in his way. Their mangled forms lay in his wake. As I dodged around them, I tried to not think about the fact that some of them were still wailing in pain. He was up ahead, diving down a side corridor. For a second, I wondered why, before I had heard the clatter of griffin talons on the floor around the next bend. Silently thanking my ears for once in my life, I dove into the double doors of the corridor after number 6. To my great surprise, he was right beside them, slamming them shut the moment I was through. I fell against the wall, my sides aching and, well, everything else aching too. A radiation sick and multiple times beaten little pony like me doesn't really run too well. Behind us, the griffins ran past, their talons making an all too obvious pattering noise. Giving a chance to breathe, I looked up, and up some more, at number 6.
Why are you helping me?
My voice was weak, panting and hoarse.
Why not?
A deadpan reply.
You're not one of them. You don't have the killer instinct in your eyes. I know a place where you'll be safe, than you probably are in whatever pit they have for you. Tag along if you want, kid.
He narrowed his eyes, leaning down closer.
But I won't slow down. If you fall behind, you're getting left. I have to.
He stopped, his eyes glancing away down the hall before returning to me. Somehow I got the impression he was only covering for having said more than he'd wanted. All the same, I nodded. Perhaps what he had said was a little rebel outpost in the train tunnels of Philadelphia. A way to get in and find other ponies to escape with, all of us together. Only to go with him meant defying my master, escaping to wherever this stallion wanted me to go. Thoughts clashed in my head as I watched the stallion creep forward, warily glancing around him with that same pragmatic look as before. I was a slave. What was I doing with all these thoughts in my head of escape, freedom, and dreams? Even my damned cutie mark was a set of manacles. I wasn't supposed to be away from this. But, try as I might, that imagery of the little unicorn mare showing such defiance and escaping to the sky in front of me just wouldn't go away. The freedom she had in the air like that. To be able to fly. Taking a deep breath, I turned, pulling my jerkin a little tighter around me before trotting off to number 6. If I wanted to, do I really? Then I guess I would have to follow him. Show that I'm willing. Show myself that I can break these chains. Briefly, I wondered if a cutie mark could change. That would be nice. Perhaps a sketchbook on my flank, or a bird flying free. We began moving again, passing staff offices of the ice rink and pausing only to check doorways. In truth, the back area wasn't particularly big. However, ruined walls and collapsed ceilings made much of it more like a dilapidated labyrinth. Truth be told, I was not feeling particularly safe. Even if I managed to get rid of the terror that my companion struck in me every time I saw him, well, at all, it would be the fear of whiplash, my master appearing from nowhere to drag me back for punishment at this defiance.
This is the way.
I blinked on reflex at his voice and didn't reply. Somehow I had an imaginative sight of number 6 turning and breaking me in two for making any noise to disrupt his own escape. Whatever drove him, it was intense. I wondered what his name was, only now thinking to bother checking his cutie mark. Whatever it meant, it wasn't cute. His massive body bore the mark of a battle-scarred and rusted shield splattered with blood on either side. It made sense, I thought. He certainly has battle-scarred himself. His dyed coat bearing those sharp tribal symbols were matched only by the lines of wounds he carried. My mind wandered on the shield's significance, before settling on the obvious. He was certainly as tough as one to survive all of that. I saw some blood from light wounds in the chaotic hallway run down across his cutie mark itself. mixing with the blood permanently showing on the icon itself. Something about it was darkly fitting. I found myself not wanting to draw that, his mark. With a sudden realization, I felt a pang of loss at my journal being left behind at the fun farm, probably being used as bedding by now by some other slave. Even with that unicorn saving my life, I doubted I would ever see the picture of my mother ever again now. Once again, I felt little tears forming in my eyes. Sometimes, I really wished I didn't have to cry so much in front of others, but it was like an unstoppable, instinctive reaction. I almost walked directly into number 6's rump without thinking. He had stopped, staring at the doors in front of us. One was a standard office door, the other a fire escape to the outside. A temporary leap of hope came to my mind as I imagined us sneaking out from under cover of the madness I could still hear outside and escaping to wherever this stallion had in mind. Reality came crashing home right back down to the wastes by seeing the clunky form of one of those damned terminals beside it. The colorful swearing of my companion under his breath as he checked didn't seem to imply he knew what to do with them either.
Locked. Why are they always locked? Ridiculous piece of intellectual.
While reeling off a few words that I'd never heard before, he vented his frustration by bucking the wall with one leg beside him, the strike offering up a sharp crack as the plaster broke from under his hoof. I heard a squeak at the sudden sound. Damn it. Why do I always have to? Wait. That hadn't been me. My poor hurting ears had heard something from behind the office door, motioning to number 6. I really needed to ask his name. I pointed with a hoof towards the office. With a narrowing of his brow, he turned and bucked the doors open. Or, rather, clean off its hinges.
Out! Now!
He roared, diving into the room as I heard a scream of surprise and shock from within. Dragged by the tail and number 6's teeth, a worker for Red-Eye was pulled into the corridor. The huge stallion dumped him right in front of the terminal, but held the buck's head looking down the corridor away from it.
Right. Now I'm betting you know the way out. Aye?
He said, voice heavy but low and full of savage intent. He clearly just wanted this over with. I got the sense that he didn't enjoy waiting around in the middle of what was to fast become an almost war zone if the riots escalated.
No, I don't know any damn password to the terminal,
he screamed in the stallion's face. I had to hand it to him. That was bravery, or stupidity. I couldn't quite tell.
So, you know the password then?
Continued number 6, speaking factually in a low tone with a lethal-looking grimace.
What?
I didn't tell you I wanted through the terminal.
Oh.
The buck looked around at the terminal, and then back at the big slave holding him.
Shit.
You got that right.
Number 6 immediately turned him around and bodily dragged the worker over to the terminal. I stood in just as much surprise as him. I hadn't spotted number 6's ploy either. Clearly, he wasn't stupid. All the same, though, I began to fear him again. He had that look in his eyes that I'd seen before, when he pounced the slavers in the Black Gate. This wasn't a slaver he was holding, though. For all I know, he might have just been a new promoted slave.
I ain't giving you the password,
he bewailed.
Stern would gut me.
I'll gut you right now if you don't do it,
countered number 6.
Or perhaps I'll just start scalping your head off the wall until you do. Trust me, I know how to keep you conscious.
He lowered his eyes.
And even if you do pass out, I'm very patient.
Fuck you! Stern would kill me!
There was a loud clang as the buck's head impacted on the metallic wall near the terminal, leaving a painful-looking indent.
The password!
Roared number 6 right into his ear. I winced, holding up my own ears and backing off as far as I could. I didn't like where this was going.
Fuck you, slave!
Clang. A second indent. Blood sprayed from his nose as he wailed in pain before spitting some in 6's face.
Red-Eye has things he could do to me that you never could. I'm too scared of him to worry about you.
Clang. A third indent. Deeper this time.
Shit! Shit!
He seemed to pass out until Six batted him across the face with a hoof. I didn't like this at all. This wasn't persuasion or defense. This was simple, outright torture. Despite what he had said to me, I did not feel reassured by the stallion one little bit. There was something just unrestricted about him, like he chose to ignore all barriers of morality. If it hadn't been for his words earlier, I probably would have just ran. However, he was making progress. The worker's survival instinct seemed to kick in, now begging for his life. I tried not to listen, to shut it out, or perhaps just hum to myself. Anything to avoid being a part of this. Annoyingly, only one of that ridiculous Pink Pony songs came to mind from the Fun Farm speakers. Right now, giggling was the last thing I wanted to do.
Ah!
I had to duck into the office to be sick, feeling my shrunken stomach doing its best to evacuate the little it had.
Daring!
I heard the worker wail.
It's daring!
"Now, wasn't that so simple?" uttered Six, his gravelly deep voice not even showing a hint of emotion before turning and unlocking both the terminal and then the door. It clicked as the bolt unlocked. With a satisfied snort, he turned to the worker. I saw murder in his eyes. He didn't want any pony left alive to spill the beans.
No, I told you! I told you!
The worker clamored, crying in pain as he tried to drag himself on one snapped leg. Oh, goddesses, it wasn't snapped at the joint. As number 6 snarled and dove for him, I managed to close my eyes in time as I saw his hoofs reach for the worker's neck. But even holding my ears didn't cut out the begs for mercy being cut short by an agonized squeal. Inside had been chaos. Outside was war. Slaves poured from the ice rink stadium doors, still in huge and snaking surges of desperation. I saw slaves being crushed under the writhing mass of dirty ponies heading in all directions when two different currents of crowds collided. They fell screaming before being trampled to death. My own bruises from earlier seemed to throb in sympathy, but no helpful mares were around to pull those poor souls out. Throughout it all, slavers galloped to and fro, pointing guns and screaming to round workers up. Many slaves made a break for it before being shot down, their cries standing out above overall ambience of panic and disorder. Even here, a few feet from the side entrance, I was almost bowled over by terrified ponies trying to escape the lashes, or just to attempt to head to their own enclosures. How could any pony move through this? It was simply madness. But above the crowds, in the Fun Farm still, even more was happening. The Fun Farm roller coaster had somehow become active, the carts hurling around the tracks at breakneck speed. I witnessed guards opening fire on it. Who would end up on that thing? And why were they firing at it with a, "Get down!" I felt the stallion grab me roughly by the jerkin in his teeth and hurl me behind the garbage bins kept at the back of the ice rink stadium before diving in himself. The rocket intended to detonate on the roller coaster had missed, before arcing on an unclear trajectory to slam into the ground nearby amidst a crowd. The concussive wave blasted my eardrums into a ringing deafness even as I felt earth and wet mud splattering down around me while holding my head to the ground. Shaking so badly, I felt I might just fall over. I stood up and opened my eyes before closing them all right away. Oh, goddesses, that hadn't been wet mud at all. I felt the stallion move. He was heading away already. Forcing my eyes open, I began to limp after him, my sprained joint aching with every step. With a start, I noticed that my jerkin had been half pulled from my body by the stallion's rough throw. I staggered as I reset it around me properly before following as best I could. I couldn't avoid looking to the side, seeing the horrific aftermath of the missile strike onto the crowd. A small crater surrounded by mutilated bodies of shrapnel and torn slaves. No doubt they would simply be left to die. No pony else helped them. They all just continued to run in panic, fearing another missile any second. Guilty feelings reminded me that I hardly was stopping either. Terror clenched my gut like a vice as I struggled to see the stallion up ahead. He stood ahead of every pony else in the area, but with my size, fighting through a crowd was next to impossible. I had to keep moving. Any second, another missile might just land, or a slaver might open fire indiscriminately onto the crowd. I had seen a couple doing that just earlier. Above us, a wing of griffins soared over toward the roller coaster, as I heard an immense crash from the building that housed Red Eye's operations in Philadelphia, the Fun Farm barn. Had the roller coaster's cars crash into it? Smoke billowed from one side as I saw Red Eye's forces moving to congregate on it. My attentions were brought back to the ground as a group of ponies rushed across the crowd's line. I saw 3 of them fall, taking out a dozen more with flailing hoofs as they all collapsed to the ground amidst the panic. There wasn't any order now. Ponies all ran in differing directions, even some back to the stadium. I dived, ducked and weaved my way best I could through the insane obstacle course of flailing hooves and bodies. All it would take is one stray hoof, and I'd be helpless on the floor.
Slaves! Halt or you will be fired upon! Halt where you are right now!
My instinct kicked in. I faltered, hooves trying to stop, but the crowd swept me on. The air was filled with screams, shrieks, and angry cries of bitter ponies trying to push their way through. A young mare nearby clutched a lifeless buck, wailing as she cried over him, trampled to death. I saw 2 slaves begin fighting over who bumped who on purpose, hooves flying as they collapsed to the ground together. All around me, looks of terror ignored the commands across the PA system. I wondered if they even heard it. Perhaps only I could.
Guards! Open fire! Open fire!
Battle saddles unleashed a torrent of firepower from the walkways above. Miniguns roared, huge anti-material rifles boomed, and magical energy weapons lent their own unique and disturbing zaps to the volley. Griffin handheld weapons joined the cacophony of weapon sounds as they picked out individual targets from above the crowd. Only now did I realize what had been happening. The slave crowd I had ended up with was heading for the main gate. It may have been accidental. I would bet most didn't know where they were going in the mad rush out of the gunfire going on across the stadium and roller coaster. But I saw what Red Eye's forces had to do. To their eyes, the slaves were making a break for it, and they intended to punish it with enough blood to quell any rebellion amongst the shapeless masses. Briefly, it had occurred to me that the majority of these slaves were not the ones whom had actually rebelled beneath the ice rink. The front ranks were torn asunder. Ponies fell in droves as the fusillade of gunfire ripped into them. I couldn't see it, being too far back, but I heard the horrible sound of bullets impacting on flesh alongside the unsettling flares of ponies atomized or melted by magical energy weapons. The crowd swung to a halt and tried to double back, meeting the rest all coming behind them in a collision that broke bones and bloodied muzzles that met another unexpectedly. The sound was shocking. Bodies slamming into one another, making far more crunches than they had any right to do. Trapped between gunfire, plowing collisions, and panic, I didn't know what to do. My instinct said, go to your enclosure. My heart said, keep going. Escape. But I didn't know which to follow. Instead, I did the only other thing I know how to react like. I cried. Fear, surging emotion, and adrenaline were all surging through me. I had never felt like this before. Emotion was not something I often knew outside of my own crying. So now, with so much of it all at once, I fell into the crowd and was thrown to and fro by it, unable to choose or know what to do. I felt my eyes water on sheer reaction of my inability to comprehend what I was actually doing, even as I felt myself knocked to the side by a large mare trying to fight her way back through the masses of ponies. Squirt! My eyes blinked open, wiping my tears before shrieking and diving to the side of a pony crashing to the floor next to me, stone dead from a bullet to the forehead. Ahead, off to the side of the crowd, was number 6, the stallion. He wasn't waiting, but he had shouted to me as he ran off down to the street deeper into Philadelphia. Many other ponies were all trying to escape that way off the main road. I could see gunshots trying to stop them. Clearly, Red Eye wanted to herd us together. There were 2 choices. 1, follow the stallion to whatever place he was heading for. But to get to him, I would have to charge through the area pockmarked with bullets and sizzling from magical energy. A few ponies were making it through without harm toward that side of the street, but not all. The other was to just stay here. Already I could feel the crowd quieting and beginning to falter under the brutal tactics of the slavers to restore order. I would perhaps be safe enough until led back to my enclosure. To dare, or to falter? I looked out over the gunshots raking the area. I took a breath, and then Master Red-Eye's voice boomed from the PA speakers.
Great workers of Philadelphia, cease this pointless violence.
I faltered.
You have made such great strides with each passing day. Did I not reward such effort with the promise of a day of rest by the break of dawn today? Yes, and hear me. Know that I am not given to breaking my promises to your generous efforts. This day shall remain yours, but this trivial panic will serve none. Not you, and not me. Not the unity that we all dream of attaining. But most of all, not the children that we strive to take to a better place with the great effort that we, together, have made. I ask all of you, would the future ascension of a safe and secure Equestria be the result of panic and disorder? Was chaos itself not the hell that we long ago escaped from? Remember your potential fellow equestrians. Remember your sacrifices. And remember the generosity that we all must show.
I couldn't move. His voice. My master. The one who paid for me.
And it is thus that I must ask you to return, to go peacefully to your places of rest for now. My attendants will inform every pony of when we may return to the day of rest and joy that had been promised. We have all given so much together. I swear to you, it will not be long. Now go. Return with order, benefiting a better Equestria, and let no more blood be shed on this day.
The decision was made. My master had asked. Even as I felt my heart screaming at me to remember what the pit had showed me, I obeyed. His words were backed up by reinforcements of slavers sending groups of slaves in directed funnels towards enclosures. I presumed that they would be sorted later on. For now, Master Red-Eye only wanted them safe and docile. Well, far be it from me to disagree. My mind screamed at me that this was wrong. I ignored it. I had returned to my enclosure. My shift would be starting soon. I saw number 6 disappear down the street. He survived. Well, good for him. I stood still as slavers ran down the lines, directing us one way or another. I don't know how long I stood there, looking at my hooves, tears still dripping from my ever-flowing eyes as I simply awaited my turn.
You there. Get to the damn fun farm.
Mare. No, not you. That one. Get back to your normal enclosure. Head down to the other side of Philly. Follow the Griffins. You. The last was me. The slaver loomed over me, and really, who didn't? With a whip magically floating beside him. I couldn't help but keep my eyes trained on the serrated and bloodied edge of the whip itself. With obedience, I lowered my head. You, slave, back to the fun farm, he shouted over the din around us, of a mass of slaves simply standing and feeling sorry for themselves. Corpses still littered the ground around us from the execution of them earlier. I began to see the reason. A simply practical solution to kill a few to stop them all instead of ongoing riot killing so many more. Just like number 6 killed that worker to remove evidence, it was just being practical. It wasn't any of my place to question. I was only ever just a cog in the machine. In my thoughts, I didn't realize how much of a rush the slaver was in until I saw the whip raise. I said, "Get back to the fun farm, you dirty little The fun farm barn exploded. The building in which I had seen the roller coaster crash into shook as its roof blew out from gradual cracking and shattering of the structure. Something colossal rose from it, sending shards of wood and brick flying in all directions around the glowing sphere of magical power. It rose slowly, gradually gaining height with swirling smoke cascading around the sphere, driven by magical energies being unleashed. Unlike in the pit, this didn't give me a feeling of hope and inspiration. It just terrified me to the core. I didn't wait to see what exactly it was. Clearly something happening due to the mayor's escape. Whatever she had done, her presence had awoken some seriously big powers in Philadelphia that were struggling to keep hold of her. Silently inside, I imagined, hoped, that none of it would be enough. Shutting out the sounds, I darted to the side of the slaver as he was distracted, staring wide-eyed at the massive monstrosity on top of the fun farm. Dodging through freshly startled ponies, I made for the petting zoo. Perhaps I could just hide in a corner until all of this just blew over. Debris rained down from above as the conflict went on above us. Ponies began running again, slavers among them. Only this time, panic was in all directions as they sought not to flee Philadelphia or to get back to their areas, but simply to evade all the scrap piling down from above. I saw a few ponies crushed under the light wood, recovering in dazed confusion. A few took shrapnel hits to the side, crying out in pain. From the stadium to here, my mind was only beginning to catch up with a consistent onrush of activity all around me. I dived into an old decrepit stall by the side of the fun farm roads to take shelter. Once inside, I simply shut my eyes, held my ears, and waited. Whatever powers were being unleashed out there, it was far too big for me. Better to just wait it out, then go back to being who I was. Even as I heard a second and even greater detonation above me that set off minor earthquake across the fun farm, I simply hid and prayed that none of it would ever affect me. Even the dust cloud washed over the stall and blew the roof clean off. All the while, my mind fought with itself between the slave and the newly found hope. But old habits die hard. Hope lost, I faltered back there. When given the choice between the free stallion and obeying my master, I had chose to obey. Silence. Finally, there was silence. I didn't know how long I'd hid. Perhaps it had been just a few minutes, maybe an hour. The stuffy sky and red haze of Philadelphia did not offer much perspective on the time of day. But when I finally crawled out, choking on dust and bones aching with exertion, it was quiet. The crowds had dispersed for the most part. I still saw some slaves clustering in ditches beside the roads or under what shelter they could, nursing wounds or huddled together for support. Occasional corpses still littered the fun farm's pathways and the street outside. About 100 meters away, I saw Master Red-Eye's guards beginning to clear the mass of bodies from the road where the slavers had opened fire on the crowds. No slavers were nearby. The majority were no doubt busy with the recovery efforts to bother a few stragglers who would be rounded up soon enough. Plus, Master Red-Eye himself had still said it was a day of rest for us. Some rest this turned out to be. But, even as I turned in a full circle, I saw no sign of whiplash. I saw no griffins shooting at me, no stallion urging me to break the rules to follow, no unicorn mare inspiring me to shake off chains at last. As I stood in the aftermath, I felt incalculably lonely. The peace wasn't to last long. My day had one less horror to inflict, one final challenge to overcome. As I made my way back to the petting zoo, intent on searching for my journal, I saw them.
Oh, look who it is. Little Runt didn't die after all.
I did as I always did. I put my head down and tried to ignore them and head for the pigsty. The pigsty was no longer there. I heard them trot up behind me before turning to face the music. I could sense this wasn't going to end well at all. I had no place to hide anymore, and there were no overseers around to stop them. I felt my sprained leg ache prematurely at the no doubt large amount of running to be involved soon. The trio were filthy, covered in grime, wounds, and dust from the massive crush earlier. I could only guess they wanted to take their anger out on some pony, and I just wandered in on the right time. They were all earth ponies. Not exactly burly, but giants in comparison to me. 2 bucks and a mare. I could swear they were all related or something, for each one of them had the same dirt brown coat with only their manes to tell them apart. Black, dirty yellow, and crude green for the mare. Each wore the ruined scraps of rags they called clothing. I was sure that they were simply for the intimidation factor of ripped fabric around their bodies. Their cutie marks, in turn, a plank of wood with a nail through it. What? 3 small rocks. He threw similar sizes at me, a lot, and the mare's was a lasso. She had once proven that talent by binding me in a rope and hanging me from a fence until Whiplash found me after her apparent brothers-in-harm had used me as a piñata. Apparently, that had been my fault, somehow. They were all despicable ponies, but they had never truly been deadly. Just an aggravation at the worst, a torturous presence that brought pain and suffering to an already miserable life. That seemed to be changing.
So, we was thinking,
Spat the mare.
you was meant to die in that pit, right?
And you didn't, somehow, the black-maned buck added while circling around me slowly. They had lethal looks in their eyes. I began to feel the fear creep down my back. Their voices were different, rebellious and full of menace, not the whining, posturing before. I backed away, trying to keep all 3 in my sight. I was let out because of what happened, I muttered, my head low. I didn't want to look any of them in the face. And I was told to return here. I just want to go to sleep. I won't disturb ya! While I had been speaking, the first buck rushed me from behind and barreled me over into the mud in front of the pigsty where it used to be. I hit the ground hard, letting out a little whine as my injuries flared all the more from the fresh impact. Behind me, the 3 gathered together, grinning wickedly.
So we was thinking,
She continued, apparently the de facto leader for today.
if you died now to entertain us, no pony would ever notice, nor care, right? Could just blame it on all the riots earlier from that big sphere pony thing that blew atop the fun farm.
Oh, goddesses. They weren't wanting to just beat me. They wanted blood. I swiveled on the ground, twisting to look at them as I felt that damned tooth had come loose again. Why couldn't I just be left in peace to slave away? The fear from before had returned. Only now, this wasn't the arena of my nightmares. This was reality. 3 ponies wanted to kill me, and were going to do so. This wasn't fair. I had chosen to avoid dying to stay with Master Red-Eye, and now they wanted to kill me. This just wasn't fair! I screamed, my thoughts exploding into reality. The surprise on their faces made them cease in their steps. Any other pony, that stallion maybe, might have seen the opportunity to attack, to hit them first. But I wasn't like that. I ran. They didn't take long to recover at all, for even as I slipped and staggered out of the mud to gallop towards the exit of the petting zoo, I heard the clatter of their hooves behind me. In my mind, something clicked. The instincts of a runt who grew up having to avoid the big brothers of the world wanting to find and hurt me. I recalled the time the slaves at the rock farm had chased me through the field because of my lack of work had earned them all punishment. I couldn't outrun other ponies with longer strides. Instead, I tried weaving, diving over bits of fence and ducking under stall doors to stay ahead of them as the chase broke out into the fun farm. Other slaves and the occasional busy slaver glanced at it, seeing 3 larger ponies chasing after a little runt scampering about with tears in his eyes ahead of them. My size let me dive into areas they couldn't. I saw an area between the funhouse, where you can just keep smiling forever, and a merchandise stand ahead of me, a thin alleyway. If I could get through, perhaps I could escape. I could go find that stallion again, take up his offer and escape these ponies forever. Can't run forever, runt. Gonna break you. The buck's voice rang out shockingly close behind me. Turning my head, I saw him approach, running low and catching up horrifyingly fast. Whinnying in fear, I ran into the space of the alley and got stuck. Even my malnourished body was just a little too thick. I got jammed into the first 6 inches. My head and front legs held up into the air as my back half of my body scrambled fiercely on the ground to try and push myself through. I could sense them galloping closer, hear their screams of triumph, and cried out as I felt myself not budge. "Gotcha now, runt!"
All jammed up for us.
I panicked. My hooves could barely reach the ground. I felt myself pushed an inch forward. I had a few seconds at most. I couldn't even look back to see them. The gap was so thin. Claustrophobic feelings rang in my head as I shook and felt myself jam all the more tightly in place. "Gotcha!" No. I felt hooves grab my rump, strength more than my own beginning to pull me back out of the gap. Incoherent shouting came from me. I didn't even know what I was saying as I lashed out in fear at the unknown assailant from behind. With a sharp crack, I felt my right hoof connect with something, the impact shoving me forward into the gap far enough to pop past the thinner areas into the alleyway. Twisting at last, I saw the black-haired buck lying on the ground, nursing a bleeding muzzle before looking at me with wild fury in his eyes. His companions had split off, running around. I couldn't waste any time. Beyond the alleyways, there was a small fence. A few seconds it took me to find a box. Celestia send my small height to the damned moon. Gave them an opportunity to catch up, only just missing me as I dived out of the fun farm into... Actually, I didn't even know where I was going. As it turned out, it wasn't a particularly easy fall to the other side. It wasn't a particularly short one either. I screamed as I fell the 10 feet to the sloped back areas of the fun farm, rolling and scraping down a rocky embankment into a muddy refuse pit filled with the piles of old scrap from the rides of the park. Crashing into the ground at high speed, I felt my entire rib cage buckle from the impact as I still lay, struggling to breathe and feeling the burns on my body from the mudslide down the ditch wall. Annoyingly, that pink pony's mantra to always look before you make that hop, skip, and a jump from the auto-corrected Fun Farm Park speakers seemed like an all-too-good advice right now. Oh, how I detested that happy-go-lucky voice reminding me of making mistakes. I staggered to my hooves, glancing around before falling again in the same spot. The ground here was without any grip, even to a pony with perfectly fit muscles and good balance, of which I had neither. Perhaps if I had enough time...
Gotcha, you little slippery bugger.
The second buck's distinctive accent shouted at me as I turned to witness them sliding down the same embankment with greater care than my haphazard fall. Oh, come on, goddesses, cut me a break. I didn't even have time to move before he charged directly into me, sending me sliding back across the mud pile into a thing of scrap. The unbalanced pile came roaring down around me, distracting the bullies as they slid their way across the mud, dodging random appliances and hunks of metal from the roller coasters that had rolled off the main pile with the sound of ironmongers being demolished. I felt a slab of metal slap me across the back of the head, knocking me face down in front of them.
Well.
The mare was out of breath as she reached down and plucked up a broken and sharp-looking pipe from the scrap pile.
Guess we'll have some fun now.
I just lifted my weary hooves in front of me. I could run or fight no more. The day's exertion and mental exhaustion was taking its toll. My body simply couldn't bring itself to move with any urgency.
Please, don't. I'll be your slaves too. Whatever you want.
All we want is a chance to let off some steam. Do the things we got to do before we were brought in here, commented the black-haired buck, stamping his hoof with intent on using just them. And after all that little buck you gave me, I've half a mind to return the favor tenfold. The things they did outside. Those ponies weren't bullies. They were gangsters. Stripped of their freedom to do as they wished. Their claws had been neutered, so to speak. Today's riots had reminded them of who they were, and I was their celebration. Time to die, runt. It's been a fun few months. I closed my eyes, not even crying anymore. Perhaps life just knew when my time was up after all. Whoosh. The raiders screamed, but not with anger, but fear. I dared to open my eyes before shutting them again quickly. The entire environment was green. Above us, roaring through the sky, was something flying with wings, glowing so brightly with its massive size that it was like a miniature radioactive sun in the air. I had seen one of these things before. A balefire phoenix. Only this one was massive. It soared above us, the sight terrifying the gangsters as it flew close to the ground, the heat emanating from it making me squeal in discomfort as I saw the trio simply flee to escape the heat. Only the mud caking me act like a coolant to allow me to bear the conflagration that now soared towards the building on top of Philly surrounded by multiple pink pony balloons. Something else was going on. At that moment, I began to get a sense of how small in this world I truly was. If powers like this were at work, well, then I truly was meant for nothing as I witnessed the passing of a greater story. Even as I lay there and watched along with every other slave and slaver in Philadelphia, we were in awe as the massive beast stood atop the building. We couldn't see what it was facing, but somehow in my heart, I just knew. It was her. We were onlookers, the crowd gazing at the passing of history as we saw the phoenix curve from balloon to balloon, igniting them with scorching green rad flame. I couldn't help a little satisfied grin as I saw at least a few of that damn pony's leering faces go down in flames, never to immortally stare at me every day again. It had come from nowhere, not from me. I was just the witness, just as I had been to the mare's escape at the colossal beast atop the fun farm. I could not know the context or connection between them. All I knew was that it was a signal to make a choice. The goddesses, or that Mare and her allies had granted me a second chance, to dare, or to falter. I lay down there for hours. The phoenix had long gone. The commotion on the building, whatever it was, now finished. I knew in my heart that the Mare had escaped. With allies like that huge radioactive beast, how could she not? But now, I just sat in the mud. What else could I do? I couldn't go back to the petting zoo until I knew that it would be protected by slavers from those gang ponies. I couldn't strike out alone. The guards were ready to shoot on sight. So, instead I just wandered the refuse slowly, limping and trying to make sense of the day. My mind was at war once again. Part of me wanted to avoid all of this, go back to what my cutie mark and my life told me I should be. Be a slave. That's what I am. But the other half could not forget that mysterious mare who had defied Red-Eye before my eyes in such iconic fashion. To escape to lead your own life. How could I not want that too? But what would I even do with freedom? I couldn't make sense of the emotion. From the mare in the pit to the mare who had looked at my sketchbook. From the gang ponies trying to kill me to the stallion murdering and torturing ponies to help me escape with him. I realized I didn't know any of their names. I thought back to drawing my own pictures, to wailing as I saw my mother in my own charcoal's rendition. A whole day of coincidence, luck, discovery, pain, and miracles, more than the rest of my life combined. How could I, a slave whom never had to think for himself until today, make sense of this? I bucked a scrap heap in frustration before screaming as the result of toppling revealed not more scrap, but the skeleton of a pony. The blackened bones clattering out, knocking against my legs even as I backpedaled furiously and fell on my rump yet again. Staring with wide eyes, I saw it was covered in rags and metal plates like makeshift armor. It was buckled and burned, probably from the megaspells. It wasn't the first time I had ever seen a skeleton. Hell, I had lived in the waste most of my life. But something struck me. Along its foreleg lay what at first appeared to be scrap metal, but memory pipped into my head. That mare's cutie mark. Before me lay a devastated and wrecked version of one of those devices. With shaking hooves, I tugged it off the skeleton's leg and began to turn it over a few times, studying it through wet eyes. The lock that kept it attached to the leg was broken. In fact, it wasn't even there at all. The screen was cracked and some of the buttons were missing entirely. On the inside, I saw exposed electronics and magic crystals that had shattered inside. And yet, I saw a small flickering light on it. The device was still active. Curiosity overcame fear. I started prodding with the machine, hoofing the buttons and turning dials. I even started fiddling with the wires, but to no avail. The most I could get from it was a sort of white noise when I hit one button that lasted until I hit it again. With a great cry of frustration, I threw the device down, the button clanging on again to fill the air with white noise as I let out every wound-up emotion I had on the offending device. I had changed by one day. I didn't even know what I was thinking, let alone what to do. How was I to make sense of all this? Mysterious mares and stallions? Huge balefire phoenixes and random monsters popping out of buildings? A chance to escape, and my damned instincts forcing me to stay and act out a slave life I was meant for? Learning to draw for my own? Being within death's reach twice in one day? Or more? Who knows how many bullets missed me? I was beaten, bruised, scarred, bleeding, sick, and probably dying within a month. And now this damn device refused to tell me anything I needed to make sense of it all when I thought I had found a fucking link. With one hoof, I screamed and hurled the device away with me with a great cry of rage.
How am I to make sense of all of this?
I galloped over, weary and sore, shouting at the device as though it were the cause of all of this.
I'm just a little slave. I don't have any freedom. I don't have any dreams. What am I supposed to do?
I collapsed, my head resting against it, nudging the dial to twist it.
I need someone to help me. Anyone. Just someone to show me the way.
The dial twisted one more bit. The white noise stopped.
Hello, Wastelanders. This is, of course, your friendly little light in the good old horrible equestrian wasteland day in and day out, DJ Pony. I'm here with, you guessed it, that thing that used to give us all the blues. Yep, it's the news. And let me tell you, little ponies, do I have some good stuff for you today, following the activities of every pony's favorite stable dweller out in the blasted pit of Philadelphia.
Footnote. Perk attained. Lucky break. Whatever has changed for you, it's been for the better. Perhaps you've been working on a sixth sense, or maybe you found a lucky charm. You gain +1 to your luck statistic.